Give it a minute. All right, there we go, recording. I'll get started here. Let's see. Give me. People showing up in person for virtual class. It happens. It's just the opposite, right? So, all right, let's get started on this one. Okay, this is good morning, everybody. Welcome to Forms Friday again, as we continue our series on covering every form, or just about every form, in the Texas Realtor Library, the TREC Library, and eventually some HomeSmart forms and some HER forms, even if we have time. And these are all being recorded. They're all stored in Real Smart Agent, so you can search for them by term, and then of course by date. So if you want to review in the middle of the night, or just get for your reference on a particular form or topic, we have them. So, and for noon, Don is continuing his master class series, doing the commercial contract, purchase contract, which I'm literally looking forward to. So. We get a lot of questions on the commercial side, and we have not done that. Now, this particular class, I did this about 2 years ago, but I'm doing it again because I love the play of these forms. We're seeing more of it. At least I'm seeing more of it come across our desk as a broker team. So I think it's timely as well. So John's got those. Okay. Get one more in there. See, you got to give them 5 minutes, not 3 minutes. And then I'll jump in, right? Got it done? Okay. So, as I said, today we're covering. So today, I'm going to cover basically 4 forms. I know with time is short, but there's 2 forms and there's 2 notices. And then kind of how they play together in certain scenarios. And I love this part of it is, so our main form, we're doing the addendum for sale of other property by buyer, which is both a TREC form and a Texas Realtors form. So it's a TXR 1908. And the subsequent notice that goes with it is the 1912. So it's the notices regarding the contingency under the addendum for sale of the property by buyer. It's interesting because it's an addendum that has a contingency in it tied to, right? So every time you have a contingency, you'll have a notice tied to it. And so anytime there's a contingency on here is an if-then. If this happens, then this happens. It's always tied to something. So we can write contingencies. Your 1 to 4 has contingencies built into it. These addendums we add in additional contingencies. So today we're talking about 2 different contingencies that both require a notice when those contingencies are fulfilled or when they're not fulfilled. And so they go hand in hand. So we're going to do the addendum for sale of other property by buyer, and then the notice tied to that. And then we're going to do the addendum for backup contract, which has a contingency within the addendum itself, which requires a notice as well. So we're going to do those 2 forms and their subsequent notices, and then kind of play around with how you could use them in a couple different scenarios, and try to do all this in about 60 minutes. So good luck, right? Here we go. And of course, the scenarios here is we're going to do if we get a full price cash offer contingent on the sale of the buyer's property. We see that quite a bit recently. Kind of why would we do this? What would it look like? We're going to do a full price backup offer. So you have an offer fully executed in place and you get a full price backup offer. How does that seller and buyer handle, and agents handle that? And the last ones, what if you accept a contingent offer, sells subject to another property, and then you get a backup offer? How does that work, right? And of course, and this is kind of oftentimes a scenario we get to face. So here we go. So a couple questions for all of you. You can unmute or just kind of ponder these as we get into the forms. Good morning, Raul. It says, why would a buyer want an offer or to make an offer with a contingency in there, right? Well, the answer there is obvious. They have a house to sell, but they don't have the proceeds from it yet, right? So, okay, well, but I want the protection to say that if for some reason my house doesn't close, I can get out of the deal and protect my earnest money. Okay, well, why would a seller want this, right? Well, maybe they're not getting other offers, or maybe they can negotiate a stronger offer on the property, knowing that the only hang up, usually in general cases, is just the proceeds from their buyer's house. So, okay, and a seller has the right to continue marketing the property to other buyers. Okay, not a bad thing. Now, why would a seller not want it? Sometimes because agents will stop showing the property, right? That may be the only offer because they're contingent. There's a lot of things to discuss with your seller or your buyer based on the type of offer it is, including this contingency. So, what are the risks to the buyer? Well, the buyer could be bumped, right? They could miss out on the offer because it's not as strong as other offers. Okay. What are the risks to the seller? Same thing. Someone may not show their property anymore. Other than that, there aren't that many, honestly, except for the buyer. In many cases, can just walk away from the deal all the way through. They could wait 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and have nothing to show for it. So that is the risk to the seller as well. So what opportunities does this bring to us as agents? Okay. And we'll talk more about that later, but there's oftentimes when you're looking for your buyer and you can't find what's in the price range that they like, but there are offers that are contingent on the sale of another property, then you have an opportunity. Hey, maybe we can bump that other buyer and get a good deal on this property. There's open, people oftentimes don't show them, but there's an opportunity there for your buyer in some cases. So be thinking about that. Okay, going into the form. So with both scenarios, we start off with a 1-to-4 family contract or any purchase agreement, and we have to attach the appropriate addendum. Okay, so in this case, we're making an offer subject to the sale of our buyer's property. So on paragraph 22 of the 1-to-4, we're going to include the addendum for sale of other property by buyer. Okay, letting them know that this is a contingency we're adding into the terms of the agreement. An addendum is part of the contract, whereas an amendment, you modify the existing contract. So we're adding this into our offer saying, yes, seller, we want to buy the house for these terms, but part of those terms is it's contingent on the receipt of the funds of this contract, of this, the buyer's property, which is interesting. In most states that I've worked in, the 4 that I'm licensed in, 3 of them have a contingent sale, like subject to the sale of the buyer's property, and they have a pending sale subject to the proceeds from the property. Texas only has 1 form. It's only on subject to the proceeds of the property. So it covers the whole gambit and gives more protection to the buyer, less protection to the seller. Okay, so we add this into our paragraph 22. We're including this addendum. We go into the form itself. I broke it up into 2 sections. It is the latest one is done in 2011, which is it's probably going to be updated at some point in time. But as you can see, it's labeled the addendum for sale of other property by buyer to the contract concerning the property at. And of course, this top line is where this is the offer you're making. The address is the property the buyer's trying to buy. Okay. And then paragraph A, sometimes our agents miss out on this. It says the contract is contingent, again, that contingency, upon the buyer's receipt of the proceeds. Doesn't mean they sold it. It means it closed and they got the funds. From the sale of the buyer's property then you would put the buyer's property that they're selling where they need the proceeds from in this next line. We've seen this messed up a few times. We need to have the buyer's property that they're selling in this line. And then it says that these proceeds from this property will be in the buyer's account, if you will, on or before such and such date. So you're given a time period for the contingency to be in place. So buyer saying, hey, seller, I'm buying this property subject to receiving the proceeds, and I'm going to receive the proceeds by this date. Okay. And so then the seller goes, okay, great. If the contingency is not satisfied or waived by the buyer by the above date, the contract will terminate automatically and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So from the buyer standpoint, if I don't get the proceeds by X date, my closing date or whatever date you put in here, I get my earnest money back. Deal's terminated. From the seller's point, they're like, okay, if this day comes, you don't have your funds, we're back on the market going to find another buyer. Okay, it's fairly clean. It may cause some additional issues, which we'll look at in a second. So notice the date inserted in paragraph 9, paragraph above, should be no later than the closing date specified in paragraph 9 of the contract. So that makes sense, right? You wouldn't want a contingency that survives closing or goes past closing, right? You wouldn't want to be day of closing and saying, hey, I don't have the proceeds of my house, therefore I'm walking away free. There's got to be some kind of skin or some kind of penalty for that buyer. And so the seller wouldn't want to do that. Paragraph 2 says, if seller accepts a written offer to sell the property, seller shall notify the buyer of such acceptance. Okay. Okay. And 2, seller accepts a written offer to sell the property, seller shall notify buyer of such acceptance, and that seller requires buyer to waive the contingency. Buyer must waive the contingency on or before blank day after the seller's notice to buyer. Okay, so first of all, sellers now accepted this offer. They're saying that if we accept this offer and then we get another offer that comes along that we like and we want to accept it, we have to give you written notice. And when we give you written notice, we're going to give you a certain amount of days to make a decision, to poop or get out the pot, the old saying, right? The idea here is we're going to give you 5 days, 3 days, 5 days, 7 days, whatever the term is generally here, to make a decision. And what are those decisions, right? And so we'll get to that in the next slide. But it says they'll give the notice to the buyer, and they'll say within 5 days after seller's notice to buyer, otherwise the contract will terminate automatically and earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. So seller says, hey, buyer, you have 5 days to waive your contingency. You know, if you don't waive your contingency, right, we're going to terminate the contract and go to our back buyer. Okay. So now we go to the next slide here. And here's the choices. Buyer may, so the buyer gets a notice from the seller that they've got another offer. It says buyer may waive the contingency only by notifying the seller of the waiver and depositing blank money with the escrow agent as additional earnest money. All notices and waivers must be in writing and are effective when delivered in accordance with the contract. This is one of those things when you're writing an offer with a contingency attached, you cannot waive the contingency without depositing additional earnest money. So when you're writing the offer, you have earnest money that you deposit right away, and then you have additional earnest money of whatever amount you guys agree upon at the time when the buyer chooses to waive their contingency, either at the notice of the seller or they've got the proceeds from the house from their property. Okay, this is really important because it's got to be waived. Because if it's not waived, even though the buyer receives the funds from their house, that date comes and goes, there's no notice given to the seller, this contract automatically terminates based on this addendum, right? It says notice has been given. The seller doesn't know the buyer has the proceeds, and this contingency is not still in place until it's waived. So there's a place where either the buyer is going to voluntarily waive it, or they're going to waive it based on the notice from the seller. And then in that case, they've got to deposit additional earnest money with title. Now, if buyer waives the contingency and fails to close and fund solely due to the buyer's non-receipt of proceeds from buyer's property described in paragraph A above, buyer will be in default. If such default occurs, seller may exercise remedies specified in paragraph 15. Paragraph 15 is a default paragraph. If either party's in default, they can either take the earnest money and walk away, they can sue for damages, or they can sue for performance. That is the other party, the non-defaulting party's right. Then right here, if the buyer chooses to waive this contingency, it's like, okay, I'm going to buy the property without this in place, and they don't get the proceeds from their house, they can have no other protection. Their financing contingency doesn't protect them. Their property approval doesn't protect them. If this is the reason that they don't have the proceeds, they are now in default and they could lose earnest money or be sued or and so forth. So this is one of those, it's all or nothing. And so when they're deciding, when they get the notice from the seller what to do, they have to take that into consideration. How certain are you that you're going to receive the funds, or can you buy it without the proceeds from your house? Okay. And it goes on to say, for purposes of this addendum, time is of the essence. Strict compliance with the times performance is stated here is required. What time are we talking about? The contingency date and the notices. There's 2 dates here. It's the date in which this contingency is good till, and there's a date that the buyer has to respond to the seller's notice. Both of those are strict timeline. They are not estimates, they are those days. So if you go beyond the date that the contingency is in place, the contract's terminated. Earnest money goes back to the buyer. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. So make sure we're doing that. And then we get close to that timeline, you have to decide as a buyer and buyer's agent, are you going to waive this contingency, or are you going to terminate the contract to protect your buyer's earnest money? Okay. Okay. So now we have a notice tied to that contingency, right? We just laid out the fact that your tenant added this to us, and you got a date, and then you got a notice tied to either the seller's response or the buyer's response. So here it says option A on the notice, which is 1912, it says a seller's notice to the buyer to remove contingency. So seller got an offer. They've accepted an offer. They're giving notice to the buyer, who's the first buyer. Says seller has accepted another offer, written offer to purchase the property. Buyer may waive the contingency by notifying the seller in writing of the waiver and depositing any required additional earnest money with the escrow agent within the time required under the addendums. We just talked about it. It's 5 days, it's $200. They've got to deposit that $200 as if they were depositing the original earnest money with to escrow, so that they know, okay? So that this contingency can be waived and the contract can stay in place. And it says, if buyer does not waive the contingency and deposit the additional earnest money within the time required, the contract will terminate and earnest money will be funded to the buyer. Think about this for a second. If the buyer decides that they want to waive it, but they do it too late, contract's terminated. If they decide they want to waive this thing, give notice and doesn't deposit the additional earnest money, contract's terminated. Make sure that they understand how important these things are to follow the terms of the contract. Even given notice, they have to understand there's 2 parts to this. Whatever amount you agree upon and the timeliness of it, depositing it in time with escrow. I saw Bara's question. What do you say, Bara? How can seller accept another offer when they're in contract with this buyer? It's the design of a contingent offer allows you to be in a status contingent or pending, continue to show, which means they can accept a backup offer. Now, any executed offer can accept a backup offer. We'll talk about that later. But right now, we're talking about a contingent offer, which in itself has the right for the seller to accept another offer to give notice to the buyer to get bumped. You can't bump the backup buyer. The backup buyer can't bump a existing pending sale, but a backup offer bump a contingent offer. Yep. Yeah, that's right. All right. So we're doing both today. So right now we're doing the contingent offer on the sale of property. Okay. Part 2 of this, Part 2 of this is the response. Buyer's response to the seller. Okay. Buyer waives the contingency and deposits the additional earnest money with the escrow agent, right? Once again, timeline. This is their choices. Or buyer does not waive the contingency, the contract's terminated, and earnest money is refunded to the buyer. So when they're faced with a decision, this is the form 1912, that they say, yes, I waive it, or no, I do not. But no, I do not, they get their earnest money back. They lose the option money, but that's not their money anyway, right? And there's no additional deposit of earnest money. They say yes, they waive their contingency, and they're buying the property regardless of whether they receive the funds or not, and they deposit the additional earnest money. Okay, it clear as mud. All right. So this is something we see a lot as well in the MLS. Okay.
Es un meeting de la oficina, pero no está. Ay, aquí está.
What, Wendy?
No, lo tengo todo.
Oh, Colleen, want to go?
Yes, real quick question. So at the time that you said in the contingency, you set all these parameters at the time that you're also executing the contract, correct? This is you're already filling in your blanks on the addendum.
Yes.
Because you're going to be doing an addendum for the sale of another property. So then my other question is, you go through all the notices and you're getting down, let's say let's say you get down for close to the date of the sale of my property and there's a problem and that we have to extend the closing date, say a day. So does that get repaired also through just amendments to the contract?
Now, you can amend just about anything, but think about this for a second. Let's say the buyer's property, the contingency is subject to the proceeds of the buyer's property by a certain date. Okay?
Correct.
And that buyer's property gets extended to a further date in the future, right? You know,
Correct.
Is that further date still within your contingency window? You have to do nothing. Okay. If it's beyond your contingency window, then you need to amend that addendum to reflect that new date and get the seller to agree to it. Right. So you have to make, oftentimes what I would do though is if my buyer has a pending sale date of their existing property for April 15th, I might put the contingency deadline April 18th or April 20th, but I want to make sure I allow time for an extension and I want to allow time for their money to actually get to them. Right, as long as my closing may be April 30th, right? So this is all negotiable, but so I wouldn't have to amend it. I'd like to preemptively plan for that, because but you can amend it. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Good question.
Yeah, because things come up that you don't expect.
Yep. And then of course, this is one of those things too. Just to follow up on that. Let's say you've received a contingent offer, and you are now great as a seller and a listing broker. You signed around. It's under contract, subject to this contingency. Well, in the MLS, the first 10 days, 7 days, the option period, you're pending, right? Option period, you're option pending. Okay, like everybody else. Okay, and then after the option period, from that option period end date to the contingency removal, you're in the pending continue to show state, right? So people know that you're under a contingency. And then after you remove the contingency, all the way to closing, now you're in pending state. So you got to be very clear on changing your status to MLS. This is one that often trips up our agents a lot, because you're not pending, you're pending continue to show because of status. This allows other buyers agents to see it and go, oh, okay, there's an opportunity here if I can't find anything else, right? And again, for the seller, you're advocating for them as well. So, yeah.
Question.
Yes,
So
ma'am.
if you have I am representing the buyer. The buyer, needs to sell their property, and they're like, okay, well, let's go ahead and send this over, or I'm, working on this one, and they're like, well, no, I'm not planning on waiving the contingency. So I'm just gonna, see if I can sell my property, but I'm not planning on waiving it in no way.
Okay.
Can we send this one without an amount on the contingency, like on letter C? Buyer may waive the contingency and then put an amount on there. Can we put NA if that's the case, that they're not planning on, or it has to be filled out with an amount?
It's got to be filled out. Now, if you include the contingency, it doesn't have an amount on it. It's just like, look, it's either is or it's not contingent on the receiving the proceeds from the sale of my house. If the buyer can perform without it, then I wouldn't put it in there, because it doesn't make your offer stronger, right? It'd be nice, like you said, in like even the right to terminate, you can do an adjusted amount, right? I like where you're going, but this is kind of like an all or nothing. It's either
because I had one. I remember a few years back, I had one with contingency, and it was my first one. And he was approved without even having to sell his property. However, we still went ahead and did this one. And we did put on there, $5,000, because he was okay. He's like, I don't need to sell my property to buy it, but let's go ahead and, so we should send this one. And it had an amount. So I'm just trying to think, okay, well, what if, he's like, if I don't sell my house, I'm not planning on buying it. So if they come in with, the seller comes in saying, notifying us that they have another offer, well, go ahead, because we're not waiving the contingency. That's what I was trying to figure out. If, whenever we send it like a 0 or NA, because we're only going to buy the property if we sell our property. If not, just, I don't know.
Again, at that point in time, if you have the response that they come over and said, we got another offer, he was like, all right, offer's terminated.
Mhm.
You know, that gives them the opportunity to walk away. If that's what his stance is, then you're good. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Well, don't worry, we're gonna go through these again, but the other form, the addendum for backup contract, right? Why would a buyer want this? Well, okay, well, a buyer wants the property and they're hoping that the first buyer backs out, right? You know, they want to be first in line for this deal. There's something about it. Sometimes a buyer makes sense because know the seller accepted an offer. They didn't want to compete. Maybe they didn't want to compete with that first buyer, but we know that a certain number fall out through inspection, through whatever, that if they get a chance to, they can negotiate a deal they're happy with, maybe not as aggressively. Seller may accept it just to have the security of having a backup and put more pressure on the first offer. You never know. It's not a bad thing. And the buyer continue to shop while they have something tied up in case it falls through. There are some good reasons for this. Now, you got to be careful. You don't want to get them committed to buying 2 different houses, but while they're waiting, right, they're not in first position. We'll talk about this in a second. They've committed a little bit of time and a little bit of money on hold with title. So why would a seller want this? Well, I just mentioned this. It gives the seller more strength. So now they got an accepted offer and they got a backup offer that they like just as much or similar, right? That the first buyer starts being swirly, if you will, and asking for a ton of stuff or amendments or extension of time or wants a lot from inspections. Seller can go, well, we got a pretty strong backup offer that, you know, we pre-negotiated that, you know, they're going to buy it as is. So, but first buyer, we can, if you ask for it, we'll say no. And you can terminate if you want to, or buy it as is. So it's more leverage for the seller having a backup offer. Okay. What are the risks to a buyer? Well, a buyer in backup position, they don't have any rights yet. They're just waiting, right? They have to get notice from the seller. This is in the backup addendum. They have no right to bump the first offer. They're just in waiting, but they may be in the first position in case something goes wrong. Okay. What are the risks to the seller? There's no risk to the seller to have a backup offer. It's only gain. So as a listing broker, you want to get a backup offer in place because it protects your seller. It also gives you a plan B if you need to. And then what opportunities does it bring to us? Not as much, except for that fact that you pre-negotiate a deal that makes sense for your buyer in an event they have a house they want that someone else got under contract. Okay. So in this scenario, though, you see a property, it's under contract, and maybe it was contingent, right? It's, for our scenario today, we're showing the property, or we were either 2 scenarios. Either we were competing for the property and they chose somebody else above us, but we asked to be in backup position. Say, hey, seller, in case that offer you chose above ours falls out, we want to be next in line. Let's negotiate a contract and get signed around on the terms agreeable to both parties, and we'll be in backup position. Or it's under a contingent sale where it says pending, continue to show, and we're like, okay, we have the opportunity to bump that buyer if we have a good enough offer the seller likes. Okay, potentially. And so either scenario, we would use this form. We would create an offer. We would attach the addendum for the backup contract as part of offer, saying the seller, we're going to agree to all the terms, including this additional addendum, which is a contingency that has contingencies in it, I should say, that we agree upon about timeline, about what has to happen and so forth, and notices. Okay, so you're acting like you're a normal contract. So the addendum, the first page is the legalese that go along with your contract language. The first line says, the contract to which this addendum is attached, the backup contract is binding upon the execution by the parties, and the earnest money and option fee must be paid as follows. Buyer shall deliver earnest money option fee as provided in paragraph 5 of the backup contract. And so basically it's the same thing as if you're negotiating a normal deal. Your earnest money and option fee have to be deposited within 3 days to the title company, like any other deal. Okay. And it says buyer shall deliver additional earnest money if you have additional earnest money. In this case, it's not required, like the contingent offer was. Okay. Then it goes on to say, like, timelines. If the last day to deliver the additional earnest money or additional option fee falls on Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. The time to deliver additional earnest money or additional option fee as applicable is extended until the end of the next day. That's not a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. All right. Typical language that goes along with the contract. This is addendum to it. And source, it says the amounts escrow agent received under paragraph A2, that's the additional amount, shall be applied first to the additional option fee and then to additional earnest money. And then, of course, buyer authorizes escrow agent to release and deliver additional option fee to the seller at any time without further notice or consent from the buyer. Got it. Okay. These are all in line with a normal offer. All right. But it's tied to a backup. Now we get to page 2 is where all the contingencies happen. You can see all the arrows here. This is very important. So, failure to timely deliver additional earnest money. If buyer fails to deliver additional earnest money within time required, seller may terminate the contract or exercise seller's remedies under paragraph 15 or both by providing notice to the buyer before buyer delivers the additional earnest money. In the normal contract, there's a timeline for delivering earnest money and option money. We know that if you deliver earnest money late, the buyer is now in breach of contract. Okay, the breach can be cured, but during that breach part, the seller has the right to terminate the contract and keep the earnest money. Okay, it's a breach that can be cured, but the seller during that period of time has the right to terminate. If the option money is delivered late, there is no option period. So it's just you can't cure a late delivery option. Same thing applies to the backup addendum. So I want to make sure we're clear on that. Okay. Failure to timely deliver. Additional earnest money, additional option fee. The backup contract is contingent. There's your contingency, which requires a notice upon the termination of the previous contract. The first contract dated, what's the date of the contract the seller actually has for the sale of the property? Except as provided by this addendum, neither party is required to perform under the backup contract while it is contingent upon the termination of the first contract. So you have a signed around executed contract, and all the timelines as far as your financing contingency, if you have something else in there, lines are not required to do anything until the seller gives the buyer, the second buyer, notice that the first buyer has terminated the contract. Okay, it's important. If if the first contract does not terminate on or before, again, a specific date, and so this is now tied to, hey, I'm in a backup position, but I'm going to give the seller and their existing buyer a certain amount of time to give me notice. So I'm not going to wait forever. I'm going to wait for a certain amount of time. And if they don't give me notice by this date in the future, then this contract will automatically terminate and the earnest money will be refunded to the buyer. It says seller must notify buyer immediately of the termination of the first contract. Now, there's two parts here. One, buyer saying you have this much time. And if you don't give me notice by this time, this contract terminates. And the second part of that is seller, when the first contract terminates, and it's within this period of time that I've given you, you now have to give me notice right away that I know that my clock is starting and I'm in first position. Okay. So must notify the buyer immediately of the termination of the first contract. For the purposes of the performance for the effective date of the backup contract, it changes to the date the buyer received notice of termination of the first contract. This is called the amended effective date. So you have an effective date of when you sign the contract, which means your clock starts, but only on certain things. Okay, only on, hey, we have a sign around deal. Hey, there's a certain amount of time for the seller to give me notice or that they've terminated the first contract. Those things, the clock's ticking on those, right? The delivery of additional option money or earnest money are ticking on those. Got it. But everything else is standing still in time, okay? Until they give us notice that the first contract's terminated. And then we have a brand new amended effective date, which means, oh, our option period is now going. Oh, our timeline for financing started. Oh, our timeline for closing has started now. Now we have a new closing date and so forth. So this is, the clock is reset, if you will, and for the new start for the new contract between seller and buyer. That's the amended effective date. So an amendment of modification of the first contract will not terminate the first contract. So if the seller in contract with the first deal extends their closing, makes a modification, amends it in any way, shape, or form, doesn't take away or doesn't affect this contract at all. We're just waiting for them to be terminated or to go past this date that we gave them. Yeah, that's it. The buyer in the backup position is either the date will come and go and the contract terminates, or the seller will notify us that we are now in first position. That's it. And so anything the seller does with the first buyer doesn't apply to us whatsoever, except for terminate it or continue to go forward past the date. Okay. If buyer has the unrestricted right to terminate the backup contract, the time for giving notice of termination begins on the effective date of the backup contract, continues after the amended effective date, and ends upon the expiration of the buyer's unrestricted right to terminate the backup contract. That's a lot. What does that mean, though? It means that Colleen has an offer on Raul's property. Raul's got a deal with Sandra, okay? Raul and Sandra's got a deal that Colleen's sitting here waiting for that deal to fall apart, okay? Colleen says, okay, I'm going to give you 3 weeks to give me notice that your buyer's deal has fallen through. Colleen's waiting. From the day they're executed on that backup offer, her option period starts. So any point in time between now and the time that Raul gives her notice that the first offer with Sandy is terminated, Colleen's buyer can walk away. They paid their option fee to have the right to walk away at any point in time. So it goes that entire 3 weeks prior to getting the notice. And then say Raul gives notice right before the deadline. Now Colleen's now in first place or first position. Her offer, her buyer now is buyer number one. From buyer number two to buyer number one. That option period that she listed in the original contract, that's 10 days, now starts. You have 10 additional days to walk away for any reason. So it protects the buyer in the backup position that if they do find something else while they're waiting for the seller to give them notice. If they decide they no longer want the property, all it costs them is their option fee to go bye-bye. And in addition to that, once they get in the contract, they still have the additional days under their now effective amended date to terminate for any reason whatsoever during their option period. So that there's another reason why this makes sense for a buyer. They have flexibility. Yes, Raul.
Yes, and the best way also is, let's say I'm working with Sandra on the transaction, and to notify Colleen, it could be also immediately. Let's say we do have to clear the close, and I'll say, Colleen, give her a call immediately, and let her know that we are going to be closing the next day, and she's going to pretty much be off that contingency.
Always good to communicate with all parties because, hey, how are we doing? This offer looks pretty good. I'll let you know when we terminate so that the buyer knows that this deal is now terminated. There's no chance to move into first position. That's very good. Vice versa. Hey, Colleen, this is looking a little shaky. Let your buyer know that they may be moving into first position soon. He knows, right? It may not close. And so there are those things as well. Okay. The end of this paragraph K basically says time is of essence again. Reminding us all this is part of the contract for the backup offer. All right. There's a notice required because we had a contingency in the addendum that says that the seller has to give us notice and we've given them a certain amount of time. So if you look at it, it says in accordance with the addendum for backup contract, seller notifies the buyer that the first contract is terminated. The contract with the buyer is no longer subject to the contingency described in the addendum. They're removing this backup contingency, and the effective date of this contract is now amended to. So this notice from the seller says, Colleen, my deal with Sandra has been terminated. This backup contingency that we're in is no longer in place. It's been removed by this notice. And our new deal together, our effective date is today. So today is day 0 for timing purposes. This doesn't require a buyer signature. This is just, hey, buyers agreed to this up front. Seller's now given notice within the time period we gave them, and it removes the contingency. So you always need a notice to remove a contingency. So long as they're doing it in proper order, now you've replaced the first offer, first deal, the first buyer with the second buyer. Okay, that's the way it's supposed to work. Okay, now Seller's notice to buyer removal. So what notice would a buyer in backup position give to terminate, right? This is one of those things. This is not a trick question. So let's say the seller did not give you notice, Colleen, right? That while you're in the backup position, your buyer does decide to go somewhere else. What would they send over to the seller, notifying the seller you terminated your offer, your backup offer? It's the buyer's notice to terminate, right? Right to terminate, because you're in your option period from the day of your effective date all the way to the point where they amend the effective date. So you have a form already. There's not a written notice; it's a different written notice. You're terminating your contract under your option period. So it's pretty cool. No? Okay. Scenario A, we have a full price cash offer, but it's contingent on the sale of the buyer's property. We see this quite a bit, especially when there's more inventory, when markets slow down a bit. And so I've seen several of these recently. So, okay. So we add in the addendum for sale of the property, the TXR 1908. A seller gives notice to the buyer to remove it if they get an additional offer. They give it yes. Then the buyer would deposit additional earnest money and additional earnest money and go pending. Got that. Satisfied. If the seller gives notice and the buyer says no, the deal is terminated and the buyer gets the earnest money. Okay. So the scenario A, they get a full price offer and the buyer they decides that, you know what, I don't want to be in this place where I can be bumped anymore. They can use the same form, TXR 1912, to remove their contingency to no longer be in that place where they're vulnerable. Let's say that they got the house, they're just waiting for the proceeds, they've already went to closing. They could choose to remove it because either that, if you don't remove it, remember the buyer, if they don't remove their contingency, the contract will automatically terminate upon the date. So I got my proceeds. My contract says I have to have my proceeds by the 15th. I got them on the 14th. The buyer's got to give notice that, hey, we've got our proceeds. The contingency has been satisfied, but they got to deposit the additional earnest money so that the contract continues and doesn't automatically terminate. So there's sometimes buyers, agents will miss this part. Even in the best case scenario where they got the proceeds, they have to give notice, and within the contract contingency time period, and deposit the additional earnest money to make sure they've removed this contingency. Okay. Scenario B, we just did the backup offer. So you got the 1 to 4 family contract, you attach the backup offer, you have a fully executed contract with deposit, earnest money, option money. Seller gives a notice to the buyer that the first contract now has terminated. Of course, they give that notice in Form 1913. The buyer says, great, we're in first position. There's an amended execution date and extended option period, right? Because they started the option period at the time of effective date, and it extends through coming in first position and, of course, into the whatever time period that was. Here's the fun one. So if we accept a contingent offer, seller said, hey, I take the offer, you can sell your house, we're good to go. We got the 1 to 4 family contract. We've got the addendum for sale of other property. We are in status of pending, continue to show. Okay. Another buyer comes along and they say, you know what? I want to buy this property. We're going to put in a backup offer on this property and negotiate with the seller. So we trigger the seller's responsibility and right to give the first buyer a bump notice. So we negotiate a 1 to 4 contract. We attach an addendum for backup contract with the seller. Seller now has agreed upon deal with the second buyer for a fully ratified executed contract. Okay. Second buyer performs all their duties as far as earnest money and option money. Now they're waiting for the seller to do so. Seller now goes, hey, all right, I've got a good offer in back. This first offer still has this big contingency in place where they can walk away for any reason if they don't receive their proceeds by such and such a date. I'm going to give this first buyer notice, hey, I've got an offer that can close. There's no contingencies in place with this other offer. There's no home sale contingency, and therefore I like it better. So I'm going to give you 5 days to waive your contingency and move forward, or terminate so I can go work with the second buyer. Okay? So Seller now gives that notice using the form 1912 to the first buyer. Buyer number one has two choices. They can waive their contingency, put their earnest money at risk, but close, hopefully, moving forward, because there's no longer a way for them to walk away for not receiving the proceeds from their house. Okay? Or they can terminate the contract, keep their earnest money, and go find another house. If buyer one terminates the contract, seller then turns around and notifies buyer two. And he uses that form 1913 and say, buyer two, our first contract with buyer one is now terminated. You are now buyer one. Congratulations. And now buyer two becomes buyer one, right? So it's this thing as a listing agent, you're negotiating the deal with buyer one, knowing that you have a timeline coming up, knowing you have to give notice, but you can't give notice to buyer one to bump them until you get buyer two. And buyer two, you have to make sure you're managing that the buyer one actually, being buyer two, actually follows through and deposits earnest money and option money, so that we have a ratified agreement that gives your seller the right to give buyer one the notice. There's like the juggling balls, but you put them in the right order, right? And so now, how's that look like? First offer has the contingency addendum attached to it, and here's the contingency addendum with a date on it, right? We're waiting for the funds of the property. You get buyer number two comes along over here, and you negotiate another offer with buyer number two, signed around, because it's in backup position. You're not selling the property twice. It's contingent on the first offer terminating. That's why we can do this. The only way we can do this is if the backup addendum clearly states nothing takes effect until the notice from the seller telling you the first one's terminated. So there's no dual selling of the same property, okay? And of course, there's a contingency in place. Now you got the backup offer in place, and you've got the first offer in place. The backup offer triggers the right for the seller to give notice to the first buyer, as we said, using the form 1912, saying, seller, hey, buyer, we received an offer. You're on the clock to make a decision, okay? Either way, the seller wins. Buyer one waives their contingency. Now the seller's protected, and they close and get the money, and they're good with the buyer they won in the first place. Or if the buyer terminates, they got a backup offer that can close without a contingency. So it's a win-win for the seller. And of course, then the buyer will respond accordingly using this form, the same form, 1912. Either they're going to waive it or they're going to terminate. And then once they get that response, the seller gets a response from the first buyer on their choice. Seller then turns around, as Raul said, and gives notice to the second buyer. Either that they're in the first position, or there's no longer a contingency. There's no way to bump the first buyer. Pretty much the second buyer is gone. Okay, and it's communication. All right. Question. I know you're going to have questions on this. So, what do you got? Yes, Raul.
Yeah, sometimes if you're on the other side, placing the contingency for your client, for the home buyer, sometimes you want to have that call where it's going to be for your side, for your kind of best news for your client. Like, wait a minute. Well, just like, the offer is not going to go through after all. We don't have clear to close. Buyer, the present buyer decided not to buy, and then we're the next runner up, kind of in a beauty pageant, right? But sometimes that we have to alert our clients, there's a 50-50 chance, just like everything. And in the meantime, we were looking for some. I know you want this house, and just kind of guide them on the either good news or bad news that might be coming up. Yes.
Yep. I would say on the backup offer too, for all of you, if you're a listing broker, you want a backup offer, regardless. Doesn't matter what kind of offer your sellers accept, you want a backup offer. It gives your seller much more leverage, right? And a buyer's agent, if you, part of this is strategy, right? Your buyer's looking, they're not finding anything, and they like houses that have already been taken. They're like getting defeated because they're getting beat out. Part of the strategy is get them to be in a backup position. They may win the house. It's a 50-50 chance, maybe like in some cases to get it. But now they've gone through the practice of writing an offer, right? They understand the process. You've shown your credit, your professionalism. You've shown them how it looks, how it works, and then they're still looking. And they're going to be quicker to write another offer, in my experience, on another property, because they get tired of waiting and so forth. But it's the idea here is you're going through the process. They're not like, they're like, oh, we're doing something. It's powerful. So And like I said, I've won some properties being in backup position because we negotiate a good offer. Seller wants to work with us. And so they won't they'll find any way they can if the first buyer won't, right? To give leverage. So that was good. Yes, Don, something? Nope. Jerry, you're up, bud.
Hey, I just want to add, a lot of timeline to manage here, and communication is key. However, I also recommend to use the same title company for all these backups. Just a recommendation, but because it helps keeping track of things.
Yeah, that's a very good recommendation. There's a couple of things I run into this locally. You got to make sure your title company understands this as well. Sometimes they won't open up 2 escrows on the same property because they're like, no, they don't understand the backup idea. On some of these, and that's the only other reason sometimes you would use 2. But you're right; it makes it a lot easier if you want to do if you're closing one and buying one too. Like if you're doing a back-to-back sale, closing on the buyer property and buying the seller property, great to use the same company. But sometimes we run into that. They want to receive earnest money on a property that's already under contract, and that's something you have to explain to what's going on. Yes, Marie.
Hey, you said 3 weeks on the first contract to get processed. To me, it seems like it's kind of 3 weeks a long time, because by the time you write a contract, the agent should already have those buyers pre-approved and done their paperwork. So 3 weeks.
I was talking about time to sell their property and receive proceeds, Marie.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, this is the subject to the sale and receipt of the buyer's proceeds from the sale of their property. Now,
Okay.
Texas is pretty wide open on this one, Marie. This is interesting. It's why it's a kind of a great contingency for a buyer selling a property, because it's not contingent on them selling it. It's not contingent on them falling apart. It's only contingent on receiving the funds from it. So the seller, it's not as good for them because they have no control. Either the buyer receives it or they don't. So that timeline gives them that window to walk away based on that specific thing only. And so you want to keep it as tight as possible. That's why a listing broker, when receiving a offer with this contingency, would want to know, is the property listed? Is it marketed well?
That is correct. And
Yep.
also, as far as communication and email, because email, you have proof that you did email that agent. And then this way you can put it on your file, time and date. So it's a very good class. I really enjoy it.
Thank you. It's really one of those things we have to communicate. Even if you have a phone call or a text message, follow up with an email. Always cover, as we always say, compliance-wise. But these forms are designed to give written notice, but in email as well, it's always great to make sure you know what you're doing and communicate clearly. Hey, the offer's doing great or whatever. Any other questions? Don, got anything to add to this?
No, sir. It's
Okay.
great.
I love how these work together. And again, the backup offer we see not as much, just because it's pending, it's going to close generally, but there's an offer. Continued offer, we're seeing some of those. And then on the seller side, why would I encourage a seller to accept a contingent offer, right? And that's one of those things. Is it strong enough? Do we negotiate an offer where you might get more than you would anywhere else? Okay, great. Is this house likely to sell? The buyer's house likely to sell? Is it a good market? Is it with a good agent for that matter? Is it already in the market and they're getting lots of activity? Okay. Or are they already pending, right? They're just waiting for their past inspection period and they're going to close. That's a good offer. Okay. That would be probably one that I would recommend saying. With the coaching that our showings will probably drop. We'll probably get a lot less agents showing it. So this may be our only offer. However, we can accept another offer, and I'm going to try all I can to make sure we get a backup offer that is non-contingent, so you have some security in that and use that as leverage if you need to. And once we get a backup offer, we can now give notice to this first buyer that, you know what, you don't need that contingency anymore. All you're doing is waiting on your proceeds, so let's move forward. It just secures the seller's position. So in some cases, it just makes sense. I know way too many agents say, no, we won't accept any contingent offer. No, Well, don't hurt your seller that way. It may be the best offer they receive. The same thing goes on a little side here based on the type of financing they have. Just because they're VA finance or FHA finance doesn't mean you shouldn't accept it. Look at the pros and cons. There are some differences, right? Especially if you're pushing value, but yeah, that money spends the same as any other money. So don't rule the market out for them. Raul, do you have anything else for us?
We're good for the day. Thank you. Great, instruction on these 2 forms today. 3 forms or 4. Yes.
Yeah, I like the fact that they work similarly, the idea here, except though the backup addendum, obviously, right, when you go into first position, you have an effective, amended effective execution date. Yeah, that doesn't have anything to do with the contingent offer. It's part of the deal. Once this is waived, you've got a timeline to deposit the additional earnest money, and you're moving forward. That's all it is, or terminating. And so to Marie's point earlier is, ideally, on the listing side, you want that time period for the buyer to receive the proceeds as short as possible. On the buyer side, you want it as long as possible. I've actually written offers and got them accepted, having my buyer's sale of their other home contingency all the way up to the day before closing. Okay, seller accepted it. I protected my buyer that no matter what happens, they could walk away if they didn't get the proceeds, if their house didn't sell. Or if it fell through and they got another offer, right? I allowed enough time for that to happen. Because it's not about if that particular buyer bought the house. It's will they have the money they need in their account by the time that the expiration is up. So again, it's all negotiable.
And you would see maxing during, was it 4 or 5 years ago during the pandemic, where you would have the backup offers a lot higher in the actual offered price. And now, even if you're doing a backup, the seller's agent can say, go ahead and submit the offer. Well, it's going to be about 10 or 15,000 less. Yeah, go ahead and send it in. At the end of the day, they want that backup, and it might be a good price for your client.
Yep. And that's a very good point, Raul. I mean, obviously markets can shift, but if you have a backup offer, now there's 2 things for a seller. 1, it gives them leverage for the first buyer. We get that. But 2, you can actually say, look, I already got a good buyer. I'm happy with my buyer. But if I want to work with you and put you in backup positions, like, I don't give me any right to bump the first buyer. They have the right to perform or not perform, right? Until they can't, that doesn't matter. So I'm going to make an offer with you, Raul, with your offer, that I'm going to say, what? If I'm going to accept it, I don't want nothing. I don't want no option period. I don't want no financing period. You got to perform, by this date. And I'll accept that offer. So you have the opportunity to make your backup offer even stronger in the event that the first offer doesn't work. So, yep.
That's right.
Good call. All right. And all right, thank you, Don. Appreciate that. Any other questions? Okay, cool.
Okay, I just have a comment. This gave me an idea to create a new template. Now, instead of sellers, buyers, now we have a template for backup offers, and we can create a template for contingency. So I think it's good to have them separated. That way, you know which forms you really need.
True. We should actually, that'd be a good trick too, not just the contingent offer and backup offer, but to your point, Don, they already laid out, but if we could lay out, if you have this contingency, this is the notice you need. Here's the contingency, here's the notice you need, and all the way down the line. There's a lot of them, right? Even the ones that are in the contract, right? Here's the notice or where you find the response to it. So that'd be good. Thank you. Anything else? I'm going to stop recording then.